The evening began quietly inside an old community hall where a small charity gathering was taking place. People arrived one by one carrying polite smiles and calm expectations. The air felt warm and familiar as soft conversations blended together. Nothing about the night suggested that it would become memorable. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, tables held simple refreshments, and near the front of the hall stood an upright piano that looked well cared for but unused. Most guests noticed it only briefly before turning their attention back to their conversations. Among the attendees was a man who stood out only because he tried so hard not to. He arrived alone and chose a seat near the back wall. His movements were careful and quiet, as if he wanted to avoid being noticed at all. His clothes were clean but showed signs of age. His hands rested calmly on his knees, and his eyes observed the room without judgment. When someone passed by, he offered a small, polite smile, yet he did not seek conversation. To everyone else, he seemed like just another guest filling an empty chair. The event was hosted by Alina, a retired music teacher who had dedicated her life to teaching young students the power of sound and discipline. She had organized the gathering to raise money for local arts programs, hoping to inspire the community to support music education. For her, music was not just entertainment, it was a language that connected people. However, as the evening continued, a quiet worry settled inside her. Earlier that day, the pianist she had hired canceled due to illness, leaving a noticeable gap in the program. Alina moved through the hall with grace, greeting guests and thanking donors, yet her mind kept returning to the silent piano. She knew the audience expected a performance, and without it the event felt unfinished. Each time she glanced toward the instrument, she felt a small sense of loss. Music had always been the soul of gatherings like this, and the absence of it made the room feel incomplete despite the friendly atmosphere. As she scanned the room again, her eyes paused on the quiet man at the back. There was something about his posture that felt familiar to her, a kind of calm focus she had seen many times before in her students. It was not confidence but readiness, the kind that comes from listening deeply. She could not explain why, but an instinct shaped by decades of teaching nudged her forward. Alina approached him with a gentle smile and asked if he was enjoying the evening. He looked up slightly surprised, then nodded and replied that it was pleasant. His voice was soft but steady. She hesitated for a moment, then asked if he played the piano. The question seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted, and for a brief moment his guard slipped, revealing something thoughtful and distant. After a pause, he answered that he used to play a long time ago. Their conversation lasted only seconds, and no one else paid attention to it. Alina thanked him and stepped away, her heart beating faster. She knew how uncomfortable it could be to perform unexpectedly, especially for someone so reserved. Still, she felt strongly that leaving the piano silent would be a missed opportunity. She weighed her decision carefully as the event continued, knowing that whatever choice she made would shape the rest of the evening. The man returned his gaze to the floor, but his thoughts drifted far from the hall. The mention of the piano had awakened memories he kept hidden. He remembered hours spent practicing alone, learning discipline through repetition, finding comfort in melody when words failed him. Life had pulled him away from that world, responsibilities had replaced passion, and music had slowly become something private. He had learned to keep that part of himself quiet, not because he lacked ability, but because he no longer expected anyone to listen. Soon Alina stood before the guests and spoke honestly, explaining that the planned performance could not take place. A ripple of mild disappointment passed through the room. Then she added that someone among them had once played the piano and had agreed to share a short piece if everyone was willing. Murmurs spread as people looked around, curious and unsure. When Alina invited the silent guest to come forward, the hall grew still. Heads turned toward the back as the man slowly stood up. His movements were cautious, and uncertainty showed in the way he took his first steps. No one recognized him, no one knew his story, and no one expected anything special. As he walked toward the piano, the moment balanced between awkward silence and quiet anticipation, and without realizing it, everyone present was about to witness the beginning of something unforgettable. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The man stood beside the piano, feeling the weight of many eyes resting on him. The room that once felt distant now seemed closer and warmer. Every sound felt sharper, the shuffle of chairs, the soft breathing of the audience, even the quiet hum of the lights above. He placed one hand lightly on the edge of the piano as if greeting an old friend. The surface felt familiar under his fingers, worn smooth by years of use. And that simple touch stirred something deep inside him. Alina offered him a gentle nod and stepped aside, giving him space without pressure. Her trust felt steady and sincere. The man lowered himself onto the piano bench, adjusting his position carefully. He took a slow breath and rested his hands in his lap for a brief moment. His mind was not racing as one might expect. Instead, it grew strangely calm, as if the noise of the world had faded and left only him and the instrument. He looked down at the keys. Their black and white pattern brought back memories of early mornings and late nights, of discipline and quiet joy, of moments when music was the only place he felt understood. For years he had avoided this feeling, telling himself that part of his life was over, yet now it returned without asking permission. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, not yet playing, simply feeling their cool surface beneath his skin. The audience waited in silence. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others exchanged uncertain glances. No one expected much from this quiet stranger. A few people assumed it would be a short and awkward attempt, perhaps a simple tune played nervously before polite applause. The stillness stretched, not uncomfortable but full, as if something unseen was gathering strength. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft and careful, almost tentative. They drifted into the room like a question rather than a statement. His fingers moved slowly at first, testing the sound, adjusting to the feel of the keys. The melody was simple, something familiar yet not easily named, and it carried a sense of reflection. Conversations stopped completely. Even those at the back of the room turned their attention forward. As the music continued, his confidence grew naturally, not through force but through memory. His hands began to move with greater ease, flowing from one note to the next. The melody deepened, layering emotion into sound. The piano no longer felt like an object on a stage. It became a voice, speaking clearly without words. The man straightened slightly, his posture changing as the music took hold of him. Alina watched closely from the side, her heart tightening with recognition. She knew this was not casual playing. This was the sound of someone who understood music deeply, someone who had lived with it. She saw the subtle movements of his hands, the way he listened to each note as it faded, adjusting his touch with care. This was not a performance meant to impress. It was an honest expression unfolding in real time. The audience felt it too. Faces softened, eyes widened. A few people held their breath without realizing it. The music carried a quiet intensity, not loud or dramatic but sincere. It told a story of time passing, of loss and endurance, of hope held gently rather than shouted. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening now found themselves drawn into something personal and unexpected. The man closed his eyes briefly as he played, allowing himself to be fully present. For the first time in many years, he was not thinking about expectations or outcomes. He was simply playing. Each note felt like a release, a reminder of who he had once been and who he still was beneath layers of routine and silence. The piano responded faithfully, filling the hall with warmth. As the piece grew richer, subtle changes in rhythm and tone revealed skill shaped by long practice. This was not a memory being replayed, it was a living moment. The audience began to understand that they were witnessing something rare, not because of technical brilliance alone, but because of the honesty behind it. The room felt different now, connected by shared attention. When the final notes approached, the man slowed naturally, letting the melody settle. He allowed the sound to fade gently, his fingers lifting from the keys with care. Silence followed, deeper than before, not empty but full of meaning. He opened his eyes and looked down at his hands, unsure how much time had passed. For a brief moment, no one moved or spoke. The music lingered in the air, echoing in thoughts and hearts. The man remained seated, unaware of the impact he had just made, unaware that this single choice to sit at the piano had already changed the course of the evening, and perhaps something more within himself. The silence that followed the final notes felt heavier than the music itself, not uncomfortable but full, as if everyone in the room was holding on to the same fragile feeling. The man remained seated at the piano, his hands resting loosely near the keys, his shoulders slightly tense as though he expected someone to interrupt the moment. He did not turn around right away. Part of him wondered if he had played too much or revealed something that should have stayed private. Then the applause began, slowly at first, one person clapping softly, then another, until the sound spread through the hall and grew into a steady wave. It was not loud or wild, but sincere and warm. People were not cheering to be polite. They were responding to something that had touched them in a way they did not expect. The man stood up slowly, almost uncertain, and turned to face the audience. He saw expressions that surprised him. Some people were smiling with quiet amazement, others looked thoughtful, a few appeared emotional, wiping their eyes without trying to hide it. He gave a small nod, unsure how else to respond, and stepped away from the piano. Alina approached him and thanked him softly, her eyes reflecting respect rather than excitement. She did not praise him loudly or draw attention. She simply said that the music had been a gift. As the evening resumed, people returned to their seats and conversations began again, but the atmosphere had changed. The room felt closer, as if the shared experience had gently connected strangers. Several guests glanced toward the man, now seated again near the back, but no one rushed toward him. There was an unspoken understanding that what had happened deserved space. The man felt unsettled in a quiet way. Playing the piano again after so many years had reopened something he thought was long buried. He had not planned to reveal that part of himself, and now he was unsure what to do with the feelings it stirred. He listened to the sounds around him, the low voices, the movement of chairs, yet everything felt distant, as though his thoughts were still wrapped in the music. After some time, a middle-aged man approached him and introduced himself as Thomas, a local school administrator. He spoke gently, not wanting to overwhelm him, and said that the performance had reminded him why music mattered so much to young people. He asked, without pressure, whether the man still played often. The man answered honestly that he did not, that life had taken him in other directions. Thomas nodded, understanding more than he said, and thanked him again before walking away. Another guest followed later, then another, each interaction respectful and brief. No one treated him like a performer or demanded explanations. They simply shared how the music had made them feel. With each conversation, the man felt a small shift inside himself. He realized that his music had reached people without effort, without planning. It had spoken when he had allowed it to. Alina eventually joined him again, sitting nearby rather than standing over him. She told him a little about her years of teaching, about students who believed they were ordinary until music showed them otherwise. She did not ask about his past directly. Instead, she said that talent does not disappear when ignored, it only waits. Her words were calm and certain, not meant to persuade, only to reflect what she had witnessed. The man listened carefully. He thought about the years he had spent avoiding music, convincing himself that it belonged to another version of his life. He remembered the joy and the discipline, the sense of purpose it once gave him. He also remembered why he had stepped away: responsibilities, disappointments, the need to survive rather than dream. Sitting there, he felt both the weight of those choices and the possibility that they did not have to define the future. As the event drew to a close, guests began to leave, thanking Alina and exchanging goodbyes. The man stood and prepared to leave as well, his coat folded over his arm. Before he reached the door, Alina stopped him briefly and said that the community center hosted weekly music sessions for anyone who wished to play or listen. She invited him without expectation, making it clear that the choice was entirely his. He stepped outside into the cool night air, feeling changed but grounded. The street was quiet, and the sounds of the evening faded behind him. He paused for a moment, looking up at the dark sky, and took a slow breath. For the first time in years, he did not feel like music was something behind him. It felt closer, possible again, not as a performance, but as a part of who he was. The days that followed passed quietly, yet something inside the man had shifted in a way he could not ignore. He returned to his daily routine but found himself distracted by small reminders. The sound of a piano in a shop window, a melody drifting from a passing car, even the rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk began to feel musical. He did not tell anyone about the evening at the community hall, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he was still trying to understand what it meant to him. At home, his apartment felt the same as always, modest and practical, yet one corner of the room drew his attention more than the others. Against the wall stood an old electronic keyboard covered lightly with dust, a relic from years ago that he had kept without knowing why. He had not touched it in a long time, telling himself it was there only because he had never bothered to give it away. That night he stood in front of it for a long moment, listening to the quiet of the room, feeling the weight of a choice that seemed both small and important. He turned the keyboard on and the soft hum startled him slightly. The sound felt louder in the silence of the apartment. He sat down slowly and placed his hands above the keys, hesitating the way he had at the piano days earlier. There was no audience now, no expectations, yet the hesitation remained. When he finally played a few notes, they sounded uneven at first, his fingers stiff from years of neglect. He stopped and let out a slow breath, reminding himself that this was not a performance, it was simply a return. Over the next several evenings, he played in short sessions, sometimes only a few minutes at a time. His hands ached, his timing faltered, but something deeper felt right. Each attempt brought back fragments of memory, lessons learned long ago, mistakes corrected through patience. Music was no longer distant, it was present and demanding honesty rather than perfection. He found comfort in that. Meanwhile, Alina had not forgotten him. She thought about the way he played, the restraint and depth in his touch, the kind that could not be taught quickly. During her years as a teacher, she had learned to recognize musicians who played from experience rather than ambition. She mentioned him to a colleague who helped organize the weekly music sessions, not as a curiosity, but as someone who might belong there if he chose to come. When the next session arrived, the community center was filled with familiar sounds, laughter, instruments tuning, casual conversation. People of different ages gathered without pressure, some confident, some shy. Alina noticed the door more than usual that evening, though she did not expect anything. When the man finally stepped inside, she did not rush to greet him. She simply smiled from across the room, allowing him to enter at his own pace. He stood near the wall at first, observing, listening to others play. The environment felt different from the formal event. It was relaxed and forgiving. No one demanded excellence, only participation. After some time, he sat at the piano again, not invited this time, not announced, just another person joining the sound. His playing was quieter than before, exploratory, yet it carried the same sincerity. Others listened while continuing their own activities. Some paused, some smiled, some joined in with simple accompaniment. The music became shared rather than centered on him alone. In that moment, he realized something important. Music did not have to be a spotlight, it could be a conversation. That understanding eased a long-held fear he had not known how to name. As the session ended, he felt tired but light. Walking home, he noticed the night felt less heavy than it used to. He understood now that the evening at the charity event had not been a single moment of surprise. It was the beginning of a slow return to a part of himself he no longer needed to silence. In the weeks that followed, the man began to structure his life around small moments of music, not in a dramatic way but with quiet intention. He adjusted his schedule so he could attend the weekly sessions regularly, each visit feeling a little more natural than the last. He no longer stood near the wall for long. Instead, he greeted familiar faces with brief smiles and simple words. The community slowly stopped seeing him as the quiet stranger and began to recognize him as someone who belonged there. His playing continued to change. At times, he explored old pieces he once knew well. At other times, he improvised gently, letting his mood guide his hands. He allowed himself to make mistakes without frustration, understanding that progress did not need urgency. Music became a space where he could be honest without explanation. This honesty began to affect other parts of his life as well. He felt more present at work, more patient in conversation, less guarded in silence. Alina watched this change with quiet satisfaction. She did not guide or correct him, knowing that his return to music needed freedom rather than instruction. Occasionally, they spoke after sessions, sharing small reflections rather than advice. She sensed that he was rebuilding trust with himself, something no teacher could impose. For her, this was the most meaningful outcome, not the performance at the charity event, but the renewal that followed. One evening, a young woman approached him after a session and asked if he would consider helping her practice a difficult passage. She was nervous and clearly unsure of herself. He hesitated briefly, then agreed. Sitting beside her at the piano, he explained slowly and simply, focusing on listening rather than technique. He was surprised by how natural it felt to guide someone else, not as an expert, but as someone who understood struggle. That interaction stayed with him. He realized that music had given him something beyond expression. It had given him a way to connect without pressure. Over time, others sought him out in similar ways, asking questions, sharing experiences, listening together. He never positioned himself as a teacher, yet teaching found him quietly. The role felt different from before, lighter and more human. At home, his keyboard was no longer covered in dust. It became part of his evenings, sometimes filled with sound, sometimes resting in silence that felt intentional rather than empty. He began writing small pieces not to share publicly, but to explore thoughts he could not put into words. These moments brought him a steady sense of balance. Looking back, he understood that being invited to the piano that night had not been about proving talent. It had been an invitation to be seen and to see himself clearly again. The silence he once carried was no longer heavy. It had become a place where music could return and grow naturally without fear. As the months passed, the man noticed that music was no longer something he scheduled only on certain days. It began to appear naturally in the spaces between responsibilities. He found himself humming while cooking, tapping rhythms while waiting in line, listening more closely to the sounds around him. These changes were subtle yet meaningful. They reflected a growing comfort with a part of himself he had once kept hidden. Music was no longer a memory or a skill. It was becoming a language he spoke daily without effort. The community sessions continued to grow, and with them, a sense of shared purpose developed. New people arrived each week carrying their own stories and hesitations. The man often recognized himself in their quiet behavior and uncertain smiles. Without planning to do so, he became someone others felt safe approaching. He never spoke loudly or positioned himself at the center, yet his presence offered reassurance. People listened when he played and relaxed when he spoke because he asked nothing of them. Alina noticed this shift clearly. She saw how people gravitated toward him not because of talent alone, but because of calm understanding. She believed that music created leaders in unexpected ways, and this was one of them. One evening she asked if he would consider helping organize the sessions more formally. The request was gentle and open-ended. She made it clear that there was no pressure and no obligation. He took time to think about it. Responsibility had once pulled him away from music and he feared repeating that pattern. Yet this felt different. It was not about performance or expectation, it was about creating space. He agreed to help in small ways at first, arranging chairs, welcoming newcomers, making sure everyone felt included. These tasks felt grounding rather than limiting. As his involvement grew, so did his confidence. He began suggesting simple group activities where people could play together regardless of skill. Laughter became more common and mistakes were treated as part of the process rather than failures. The sessions became less about individual ability and more about shared experience. Music filled the room in many forms and no single voice dominated. Outside the community center, his personal life reflected similar balance. He reconnected with old friends he had drifted away from and shared parts of his story he once kept silent. He did not speak about the charity event often, but when he did, it was with gratitude rather than disbelief. That moment no longer felt unreal, it felt like a turning point he had accepted. One evening after a session, he stayed behind alone with the piano. The room was quiet and familiar. He played slowly without an audience, letting each note settle fully. There was no urge to impress or explain. He understood then that the silence he once feared had taught him how to listen deeply. It had shaped the way he now played and lived. As he closed the piano and prepared to leave, he felt steady. The path ahead did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt open. Music had returned to his life not as a demand but as a companion. And in that quiet understanding, he knew that the silent guest he once was no longer needed to hide. With time, the story of the quiet man who had played at the charity event became something people mentioned now and then, not as a legend or spectacle, but as a reminder of how unexpected moments could change direction. New members heard about it casually through conversation, usually framed with humility and respect. He never corrected or expanded on the story. For him, it was no longer about that single night, it was about everything that followed. He began to notice how much he had changed in simple ways. He spoke more openly when something mattered to him. He listened without planning responses. Silence no longer felt like something to escape from, it felt like space where understanding could grow. Music had not made his life louder, it had made it clearer. At the community center, a young boy joined the sessions regularly, sitting close to the piano but rarely touching it. The man recognized the hesitation immediately. One evening he sat beside the boy and played a few simple notes, then paused and waited. Without instruction or encouragement, the boy reached out and pressed a key. The sound startled him and then made him smile. Nothing more was needed. The man understood that sometimes presence was the most powerful invitation. Eleanor watched moments like this with quiet pride. She knew that the true success of the gathering months earlier was not measured in donations or applause, but in continuity. The music had stayed. It had moved through people gently and left something lasting behind. She felt at peace knowing that the space she helped create was now being carried forward by others. The man no longer questioned whether he belonged in this world of sound. He belonged because he showed up honestly. The piano was no longer a symbol of what he had lost or abandoned. It was simply part of his environment, like breath or light. He accepted that his journey with music would continue to change, and that was enough. One afternoon, he passed the old community hall where the charity event had taken place. He paused briefly, remembering the feeling of standing up from the back row and walking forward, not knowing what would come next. The memory no longer made his chest tighten. It made him smile softly. He understood now that courage did not always arrive with confidence. Sometimes it arrived quietly and waited to be noticed. As he walked on, he felt gratitude, not for recognition or opportunity, but for the simple moment when someone had trusted silence enough to ask a question. That question had opened a door he did not know he was still standing near. And he continued forward knowing that even the quietest presence could carry a voice that mattered. The story settled into something complete without needing a final dramatic moment. Life continued in its steady rhythm, shaped now by awareness rather than surprise. The man remained part of the community center, not as a figure of attention but as a constant presence. People came and went, seasons changed, and music flowed through the space in many forms. What had begun as a single unexpected invitation became a thread woven quietly into everyday life. He no longer thought of himself as the silent guest from that evening. That version of him felt distant, not forgotten but understood. Silence had not been a weakness, it had been a place of listening and preparation. Through it he had learned patience, humility, and depth. When music returned, it did so gently, fitting into the life he already had rather than replacing it. Occasionally someone new would ask about that first night, curious after hearing fragments of the story. He would smile and say it was just a moment when someone needed music and he happened to be there. That was the truth as he saw it. The meaning of the moment had grown over time, shaped by what he chose to do afterward rather than by the applause that followed. The leaner eventually stepped back from organizing the sessions, confident they were in good hands. When she did, she thanked him not for his talent but for his care. She told him that the best music teachers were not always the ones who spoke the most, but the ones who knew when to listen. Her words stayed with him long after that conversation. On quiet evenings he still played alone sometimes, letting melodies move slowly through the room. Other nights he chose silence, comfortable with it, no longer feeling the need to fill it. Both felt equally complete. Music had become a companion rather than a destination. The impact of that night could not be measured in numbers or recognition. It lived in the confidence of a young student, the comfort of shared sound, the courage of someone choosing to step forward when asked. The invitation to the piano had changed many lives in small ways, including his own. And so the story ended not with a grand conclusion but with balance. A quiet man had been invited to play. He had answered. And in doing so, he discovered that sometimes the most powerful moments are the ones that begin in silence and continue long after the sound fades.